Hello, everyone. Hello, I'm Laura Washington, CEO of the CAYL Institute, and it is my pleasure to welcome you here with us to this episode of the CAYL Catalyst webinar series. We're so grateful for your time and attention as we try to bring to you issues of importance to children, to families, and to the early childhood education profession. Today and next month, the CAYL webinar series is being co-hosted with the National Association for the Education of Young Children, and we are delighted to do so. We're offering 2 episodes today and next month where we're really going to be talking about important issues in our advocacy. So as you're listening, remember that this episode is being recorded, closed captioning is available, and there is a question and answer session at the end of the webinar. If you want to interact with any of our speakers, we'll be putting a link in the chat, and you can click that link and have an opportunity to meet with our speakers. Our webinar series is being sponsored by the Schott Foundation for Public Education, which incidentally is the founder of the Schott Foundation. Over 20 years ago, we began. And if you'd like to join the Schott Foundation in supporting the CAYL Institute, we invite you to make a donation of $20 to celebrate our 20 years. Any amount you donate is always appreciated. Your gift helps us continue to offer no-cost experiences for early childhood educators. Today, we're so thrilled to join with the National Association for the Education of Young Children to really talk about this important election season that we're in. Brene Brown says that courage starts with showing up and letting ourselves be seen. And if you are a fan of the CAYL Institute, you know we've been having a year-long talk about courage. And that's why we're delighted to talk about courage right now in the context of our voting values and the context of our advocacy agenda. This is nonpartisan work that we must do in any election result. So I would like to ask you right now, if you could just write in the chat, let us know who you are, let us know where you're from, and let us know how you're going to show up with courage during this election season. And while you're writing the chat, let me say we have some outstanding speakers for you today that are going to give us a historical perspective on this advocacy, but also tell us what we might be doing now. And it is my pleasure to welcome my co-host, Michelle Kang, the CEO of the National Association for the Education of Young Children, and our partner in having this conversation with you. Welcome, Michelle. We are delighted to have you with us this month and next month as we talk about these important issues. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Laura. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Michelle Kang, the CEO of the National Association for the Education of Young Children, or NAEYC. For those who may not know, NAEYC is the largest professional membership organization of early childhood educators, administrators, students, and advocates in the United States. We've been a leading voice for high-quality early childhood education for nearly 100 years, and I say nearly because we're going to hit the century mark in 2026. And a shout out and a thank you to our 60,000 members and 51 affiliates who are part of our community. Today, we are here to talk about the elections, and I was glad to see childcare and early education come up in the recent vice presidential debate. It's clearly an issue on the minds of voters and therefore on the lips of candidates. Early childhood educators know the profound impact our work has on children, families, and communities. You know, if you're on this call and you're an early childhood educator, you see it every day. But we also know that without public investment and support, that early childhood education system cannot successfully meet the needs of young children and families who rely on it, and the educators who dedicate their careers to serving them. Your vote is one of the most important ways that you can lift your voice in shaping policies that affect early childhood education. NAEYC is a nonprofit organization, and we do not try and influence how you vote or promote support for individual candidates or parties at any level. But we do have a responsibility to support as many early childhood educators as possible in making a plan to vote, because when we all exercise our right to vote and engage in the electoral process, it forces policymakers to pay attention to the needs of our field and the families that we serve. So with that said, here are some immediate steps we encourage everyone on this webinar to take. First and foremost, register to vote and then vote. We know it sounds simple, but it is the foundation of our democracy, and we know it's not always the easiest step to take, but don't stop there. Encourage your colleagues, families, and community members to do the same. Second, do your homework. Educators know the importance of preparation. Take time to learn candidates' positions regarding childcare and early learning. What are their stances on the issues that affect our field? How do they plan to support early childhood education? Third, engage actively in the political process. Attend candidate forums and town halls. Share your stories and experiences. Help candidates understand why supporting early childhood education isn't just good policy, it is essential for our communities and for our nation's future. When policymakers understand and hear from educators and hear what the realities are of early childhood education, they make better decisions for our children. And finally, for those who are employers or program directors, I encourage you to implement workplace policies that support voting, make sure that your staff have time to vote, and consider allowing staff to volunteer in election-related activities if you're able. We as an organization are here to support you in these efforts. We offer numerous resources to help you become an informed and effective advocate for early childhood education. And these can all be found on our America for Early Ed website, which we will add to the chat. I want to thank each of you for being here as part of this conversation. And for those of you who are educators, who are advocates, who are systems leaders, faculty members, I want to thank you all for your dedication to children and families. And thank you for being engaged citizens who understand that our votes today will shape the world that our children are going to inherit tomorrow. So now let's meet our fabulous panelists who are going to tell us about their experience in political advocacy, both now and from a historical perspective. I'm delighted to introduce you to Niall Blass and Helen Blank. Niall Blass serves as the DMV, or DC, Maryland, Virginia, regional organizer of the League of Women Voters in the United States, responsible for organizing strategies and capacity building at the DMV and national levels. She leads the League of Women Voters' inaugural Young Voter Power Initiative, mobilizing young voters nationwide. Previously, Niall advanced social equity through political advocacy and grassroots organizing, including coordinating restorative efforts with Hoyas for Slavery Accountability at Georgetown University. During the pandemic, she made history as Georgetown's first Black woman student body president, providing students with financial stipends, career development programs, and secure housing. Niall also brings experience from the House Judiciary Committee and the Maryland General Assembly. She's a native of Washington, D.C., and she holds a BA in government from Georgetown University. Welcome, Niall. And Helen Blank. Helen, in many ways, needs no introduction because many of us who are part of the early learning community and policy community have probably heard Helen's name in the past years. Helen served as the Director of Childcare and Early Learning at the National Women's Law Center for 16 years and for 24 years as the Director of the Childcare and Development Division at the Children's Defense Fund. She was instrumental in making childcare a national priority for Congress and in shaping key federal and state childcare policies, including the Child Care and Development Block Grant, the Family Support Act, and securing historic funding increases for childcare. Helen has authored numerous influential reports on early childhood education and played a leadership role in expanding and improving programs like Head Start and the Child and Adult Care Food Program. She also created and co-directed leadership programs for emerging advocates in childcare and early learning that continue to this day, inspiring new generations of advocates. She continues to serve on several advisory boards and holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Michigan and a master's degree in urban planning from Hunter College City University of New York. Welcome, Niall and Helen. I think we're working on getting Helen or Niall's audio.
Nice.
Sorry, I thought you would be like, and now Niall, so I was just awkwardly waiting. I apologize.
Go ahead.
That's all right. Welcome.
Hi, everyone. So I guess I don't have to go into the the superfluous because, I was already wonderfully introduced. But again, yeah, my name is Niall. I go by she, her pronouns. And as a young person, I guess older than some of you, but still a young person at 24, I think that while marches are important, all these other ways in which we can be civically and socially engaged in our democracy are important. There's probably nothing that's going to be as sustainable and as accessible, with several asterisks next to accessible, because we have to look at gerrymandering, we have to look at student ID laws, all these other rules that intersect with our access to the ballot. But that ultimately voting is the primary way that so many of us are going to be able to advance our country, advance the progress that we want to see, whether it's around social programs, whether it's around affirmative action in schools, all these other things. So I actually have some slides, though I'm not planning to take too much time. But I thought it would just be helpful to frame us in some of the data that I look at when it comes to helping support and engage young people. And then some of the recommendations that I would have, not just for getting yourself to the ballot box, but for empowering and supporting your peers, and not just your peers who are also young, but uncles, aunts, acquaintances, enemies, right? Because we do want everybody a part of our democracy and well-informed as they are participating. So let me know if my screen is not sharing properly, but I'm going to try to present and go from there. Yep. So again, let me know if people can't see it. But from registration to election, we're going to talk a little bit about engaging voters every step of the way. So just to give some context about myself, I'm a part of the LWVS's organizing team. So that's a relatively new team. We've been in existence for about 4 years. And while the league is known for a lot of the work that is done about the women's suffragist movement and a lot of other work around voter education and voter registration, what the organizing team does is harnessing the power of relationships and grassroots organizing. So we're building frameworks for infrastructure around training, strategizing, and executing those strategies. So we're supporting our state and local leagues and building all these partnerships that allow us to not just have a democracy, but to maintain it and make it as accessible as possible to all the people who are in it. And so today's focus, I wanted to talk a little bit about the young voter landscape. So some of the data that, again, maybe frames how you are looking at yourselves and your peers, just some relational organizing principles. So when it comes to bringing politics into your spaces, especially for those of you who might not be used to talking about this or supporting it when it comes to your personal relationships. And then finally, just some GOTV efforts, opportunities, and some resources that I think that could be a helpful kickstart to doing that work. So I want to talk a little bit about some misconceptions that come with young people and how we vote, not just in this moment, but generationally. And first and foremost, one of the biggest things is that there's this idea that prior is that's not the case. We see that there's similar rates when they were the same age. And so what I think that represents is that we don't need to look at our engagement in support of our democracy as a phenomenon or as a lesser than. There tends to be certain systems and intersecting identities and contexts. So whether or not you're in school, whether or not you have money, whether or not you have different priorities when it comes to kids and family and other things that are just generationally applicable that kind of inform how and when different ages of people vote. But even more than that, it's not just that we vote at the rate as previous generations, but when we look at the first midterm of Gen Z, they voted at a higher rate than previous generations. So not only are we not behind the ball, in many ways we are ahead in comparison to past generations. Another thing that we kind of want to look at is gender parity. So we see across all races, so white, Black, Asian, so on and so forth, especially in 2018, data also bear out into 2022 and potentially into the next presidential election, that young women were more likely to be participating in movements and in voter outreach than their peers. And while that's really important, especially within the context of the women's suffragist movement and the ways in which young women have been taken systematically out of education and out of voter and democratic involvement, that we still want to see gender parity. We still want to make sure that the male counterparts of different systems and expectations are going to be involved, right? Then two, this is just giving a whole context for the fact that young people are diverse. And I think that's why it's so important to have us represented in this democracy, because when you have young people represented, you have people of color represented, you have LGBTQ plus people represented, you have people who are representing the interests of immigrants or other people who are still impacted by our democracy, but are currently non-voters themselves, as we see with that last data point. The one thing I want to draw attention to for the 40% have no college experience is a thing that I oftentimes talk about is decolonizing the ideas that we have around young people who are deserving of leadership and investment politically, right? And so while on colleges and university campuses, it makes sense that we do a lot of organizing there. This is a population of young people who are more likely than not able to take the time and energy to volunteer, especially for organizations like the League of Women Voters that are volunteer-based at our state and local level. We want to make sure that we're going to labor unions and workforce spaces, because young person isn't synonymous with student. Young person really means people in the military, people who are parents, all these other types of dimensions and identities. So now that we have this diverse group of young people, how do we reach our peers? And how do we not only build voters, because that is an important way, but only one way of being civically empowered and engaged, but advocates for political progress? And the answer is relational organizing. But to talk a little bit about why we need to lean into our relationships, I think the threats to our democracy in this current moment are really insidious. And I think that the strongest power that we have in facing them is each other. So when we're thinking about it, we're seeing authoritarianism, we're seeing racism, we're seeing white supremacy, we're seeing Christian religious fanaticism. And I think that's an important thing to elevate when we're looking at Roe v. Wade, the fight for reproductive autonomy, and all these other different fights that we're fighting currently. Patriarchy and all these other systems. So with these challenges and these threats, how are we going to dismantle them? I kind of gave the answer away, only because I'm trying to be mindful of time, but it's relational organizing. So relational organizing is a form of organizing that is really based in leveraging one's personal networks. So I think oftentimes, especially with the League of Women Voters, we can sometimes view the political work we're doing as parachuting in. I'm going to a different community to provide resources or to provide political opportunity. But the reality is there's so much to be done in our personal networks of friends and family and neighbors and coworkers. And through those relationships, we're able to develop a shared sense of purpose, of values, and an ability to take a collective action to make positive change. And the reason this is so important is because when we're looking at the relationships that people have with media, with political institutions, the sphere of trusted resources and trusted messengers is getting smaller and smaller. And when we look at AI and we look at the rise in mis and disinformation, that only becomes more so. A big example that I like to give is that, the League of Women Voters has a newsletter, and that newsletter may be able to reach 1,000 people or so, right? But if you right now are able to text 10 people to show up for a protest or to show up to the polls, and those 10 people are going to make it because you're the one asking, oftentimes that's a more valuable relationship to have, because people desire to understand the world, understand their ability to impact it. But when they're looking for not just general notice, but of calls to action, they're looking to friends, they're looking to family, and they're looking to local leaders. And specifically when it comes to voting rights and democracy, we see that when people are seeking information, the first place they tend to go is their personal networks, or at least the resources that their personal networks recommend. And this is just kind of giving an ecosystem of what that looks like, right? So at the broadest sphere, we see things that might make you feel trust in knowing objectively what's happening, right? And so maybe you can look at a Fox News, MSNBC newsletter headline and be like, okay, this happened. But that is very different than feeling like you're getting valid information. And even that's different than feeling like you have information that can empower you and inform how you make decisions. And a big thing that we like to emphasize, I say jokingly that oftentimes politics rewards egocentrism. And so in order to do work in coalitions that's effective, especially with other young people, you have to recognize if and when you are the best messenger for a group. When it comes to going to Mississippi for my grandmother and working with her church community, that's a place where they've known me since I was a child, right? So if I'm going there and I'm talking about things to do, how to vote, how to make things better, they trust me. I have some cultural competency there. I have some connections and roots there. But if we're trying to do a voter registration event at a synagogue in Philly, and I've only been to Philly once, my ask, my presence, even if I'm smiling and engaged and excited, is different than if the matriarch of that synagogue, who has known those people for a long time, who maybe runs that church's kitchen for several times, like not several times, but several years, asks. Because sometimes I think we feel like if we're not compelling people to act with this big democratic speech of what it means to fight for our democracy, which is important, then we can't call them to act at all. But sometimes the foot in the door isn't that democracy is at stake. It's that Ashley's asking, and Ashley's my friend. So I'm going to go to this candidate hall. I'm going to go to this town hall because she's the one asking. And it's from that point that we're then able to build out relationships and opportunities for them to not just care about you within the context of politics, but to care about themselves, to care about their communities, and to feel like what they do within that realm of politics can actually have a positive impact. And again, this is kind of just touching on that egocentrism point and why relational organizing and being able to situate yourself within a network is so important. Healthy movements are not sustained by one leader, and they're not sustained by a small group of leaders. Healthy movements thrive with a network of distributed leadership. And that's what relational organizing emphasizes. And so I just wanted to give some quick notes around how you might be able to stay in the field and engage and support the work as you're going out, whether that's being a poll watcher and all the other ways that we can do it. I'm trying to be mindful of time, so I might rapid speed. Feel free to someone to hit me in the chat or to text me that I'm ahead, that I'm fine. I just want to make sure I'm not taking up from Helen. I'm sure her presentation is going to be 2 times as wonderful as this one. But one is that we want to show moral courage. So when we're responding to people who may be frustrated, who may be angry, especially that's important within this framework of mis and disinformation, that we're moving and acting beyond just anxiety, anger, and self-righteousness, right? We're engaging in de-escalation. So that means we're making sure that we're limiting the opportunities for a situation to get more intense and instead reducing the drama. And 2, we want to shift the attention. So by interacting as much as we can with the targeted person. So if you're canvassing in a community and one of your members is a job and somebody is coming up to them and confronting them and being angry, we don't want to just go back and forth with the attacker. We want to secure the targeted person. We want to create a safe space around that person. And we want to make sure that we're bringing other people in our networks, in our canvassing groups, and all these other ways for showing up and showing out to be protective and supportive of that person. We also, when we're talking about moral courage, want to be present as an ally and an equal. We want to make sure we're not taking away the ability of a targeted person to respond. We want to ask for them to tell us how we can help. We don't want to presume. And we want to make sure that we're getting consent before we touch, before we engage, and before we try to disseminate. Because again, as much as we are trying to avoid escalation, that's the person, and the person comes first. And their leaderships and wants for that moment come first. And then now I'm going to go into just some quick resources and tools when it comes to our democracy and some of the work that you might be able to start doing as a young person. So how LGBT is showing up in the field. So if you're in any city, you probably have a local league. If you're in any state or even abroad, you have a state league. And for all the webinars and text banks and phone banks that we've been moving, you have the national league, right? So these are all opportunities that you can lean into. So we have our traditional GOTV work, but we also have our relational organizing program. So these are interactive virtual calls that bring together participants to receive training and practice reaching out to their personal networks, like I just talked about, to share election information and opportunities. We also do a lot of really unique partnerships. So Girl Scouts, Slush, we even do tabling and voter registration with the WNBA here in the Capitol. So there's so many opportunities to not just be involved in the traditional GOTV work, but in the cultural and social spaces that already may be appealing to your interests as an artistic person or as somebody who's really into STEM and so on and so forth. And this is just, I think this is out of place for my slide deck, but this is just context for as you're leaning into your personal networks and you're starting these conversations, some important questions to ask yourself. So you don't have to start with asking your church aunt how she feels about abortion, right? You can think about whether or not you've spoken to them at all around these issues. Could you or would you? And do you think they would listen if you bring it up? And are you close enough to have conversations? Because sometimes, especially in this partisan environment, politics becomes approximate with conflict. So you want people to know and think about, hey, if I bring to this person, even if it's based in data and fact, a worldview that is opposed to how they may be viewing it, do they have enough respect and regard for me to hear me out? Maybe more so than a stranger on the street. So again, just some of the questions that come to play when it comes to the work we're moving. And this is just the process for doing that relational organizing outreach, right? So you're pinpointing your specific contacts. Who do you want to talk to, whether or not they live this issue? An example I give about that is I have uncles who would never call themselves political, but they're based in Mississippi and they're farmers. And so they're seeing the difference in climate change when it comes to droughts and it comes to the crop turnover, the safety and health of their cattle. And so that's a way to bring them into the conversation around environmentalism, even though, again, they would never call themselves political. And once you identify that person, you want to take some time to really write down who you're going to be engaging. So can be one person, can be several. But a part of manifestation and actual execution of relational organizing is having your specific population of people, not just abstractly hoping that you're going to reach out to your friends, but identifying which friends you were going to reach out to. Then collecting resources. If you're going to be going to people and you're going to be compelling them to act or engage in this democracy, it's fair for them to expect you to know what to say and what to answer, whether that's election day stuff, whether it's voter ID stuff based specifically in your city or state. So we recommend Vote for 1-1 because that's a really helpful resource when it comes to providing information that is nonpartisan, but that's also regionally specific, right? So we want to make sure that people down to their address know whether or not their polling location has changed, what candidates are on their ballot, what those candidates are saying about specific issues, because Vote 411 also has candidate surveys so that people get to share how they feel about reproductive health, what they're proposing to do for infrastructure, and all those really important points. And then again, personalize your outreach. So we like to provide templates and opportunities for people to get the ball rolling, but the best person to talk to your mom is you. The best person to talk to your best friend is you. So we really empower and implore you to figure out the message that would make that person really open the door to you in this political work, even if they've not done it before. And then you actually have to send a message. So I'm not going to waste time on that, but you actually got to do it for it to be impactful.
Are you ready to vote? I am.
So again, this is Vote 411. We have English and Spanish languages. That's something that I'll elevate because, again, so many people are new citizens and all these other dynamics. So we want to make sure that all of this information is accessible as possible.
Thank you.
This is kind of what it looks like when you're on the website. League in Action is our digital platform for organizing and engagement. So it's opportunities to RSVP for events that are happening at your state and local level, for you to enter stories, surveys, and to sign up for rewards, depending on how many people you relationally organize with us, getting updates on Supreme Court cases and a lot of other really important information. And I think that's my closing out. So this is our email. You can scan that to learn more about some of the work that we do. And then thank you so much. I hope I had to go outside to get good Wi-Fi because my Wi-Fi was fighting us during our pre-call. So I hope that this segment wasn't too discombobulated for you all. And I do hope that there's been some helpful tidbits of information for you to get. But I'm excited to hand this over to our other panelist or presenter, Helen. So go for it. And again, thank you all for your attention.
Thank you, Niles. I think that one of the most important things Niles said was just do it, right? And she also, in talking about how you approach people and how you get people to do something, she talked about a lot of the essentials of relationship building, which also relate to how you build a field. I'm actually going to give you a bit of a history about how at Children's Defense Fund, we actually built the field and showed what the importance of the field could be and what the importance of anyone working on early childhood and children's issues could do to make things happen. Ultimately, I was driven by how to help the most vulnerable families and children and what policies might best work to do this. And I knew that all these policies were actually driven by money, that you could have the best policies in the world, but if you didn't have money in a field that is noted for low pay and lack of support for our poorest families, it wasn't going to work. And I also always had in mind how the people who governed, whether they were in Congress or the administration, was going to impact our success. When I came to Children's Defense Fund in 1978, sounds like forever, right? We didn't have a membership. We weren't a membership organization, but we knew that working with a field was critical, both to ensure that we had a team, but we had facts on the ground to understand what might work and what might not work, what kind of money was needed, and that we had credible information to work with Congress and the states. I always thought that organizing was absolutely critical because I sort of began as an organizer, and so were facts. At CDF, sometimes we weighed our testimony. I think you have to be credible and you have to be able to defend what you want and why. I did two things at first when I came to CDF that helped me see who was out there. You have to remember that NAEYC did not have a lobbyist. They didn't play a major role in everyday work with Congress. NACRA, or what became Child Care Aware, there were some R&Rs around the country. There was no national office. So there weren't major groups that had connections with people in childcare, except for National Black Child Development Institute, the Ys, the YM, YW, but not a lot from the early childhood field. I managed a newsletter called CDF Reports, which gave me an opportunity to find who was doing what and do stories and interview people in the world. And I managed what was called the Network Project, where we went out around the country and found out who was doing what for children in states and brought them together. So that was my beginning. And then I became child care director. And when that happened, it was around Reagan was elected, and President Reagan in 1981 he made massive budget cuts, and he cut children's programs by about 10 billion. And what's important, for anybody working on issues is to know where you can find opportunity. And sometimes when it's, you think the picture is the darkest, there's a chance to do something and to put a stake in the ground. And we did several things that I think are important lessons today. I created a project called Child Watch, which we did in cooperation with a number of women's groups, but the junior leagues were our top partner. Child Watch had a manual, and it had questions on 4 key topics affecting children, and childcare was one of them. And junior league members and others went out and talked to people in the field, probably many people working on childcare or child welfare or income support or child health, to see what was happening on the ground. So what does that mean? We need stories. Where do we get our stories? Still today, we get them from the field. You give us what's important to know to make a difference. We also had to see what the impact of the budget cuts were. How are we going to tell our story? And this was the beginning of these endless reports. Now we did them at National Women's Law Center on the impact of budget cuts on state child care assistance programs, or what is the status of state child care assistance programs. That budget cut the major source of support for child care that year, which was the Title 20 Social Services Block Grant, by $600 million. And what we looked at, no surprise, did states limit eligibility for child care subsidies? Did they expand their waiting lists? This sounds so familiar. Did they lower their rates? Did they make family co-payments higher? And we interviewed state child care administrators, because another field and important partners are people who run programs in states. Many of them came forward to testify. So we had a report that we could take to the Hill to show what happened. Then we wrote something called the Child Care Handbook, where we found people doing innovative work around the country. Tootie Sherlock, who ran a child care R&R in Minnesota, was one of the people in the handbook. Sophia Harris, who ran a network of African-American child care programs in Alabama, was in the handbook. And we also found people who were running child care programs that were funded by corporations or their employers. And we had useful information, but the conclusion of this report was that you needed public money in order to do these, to really make a difference for children and families. So then we went forward using what we learned from the field to try to make a difference. The 1981 budget bill had improved the dependent care tax credit that families could use for childcare, but that credit wasn't available to low-income families because they didn't do a large tax form. It was also not refundable. And one of the first things we did was send alerts to the field. I had put together a list to go to regional hearings and talk about putting a line on the credit for the short tax form. I did that with my friend Duffy Campbell, who was at the National Women's Law Center. And when the field started showing up at hearings and writing letters to the tax form department at the Internal Revenue Service, they looked up because they never heard from anybody from the child care field. And we won. We got a line on the short form. But our other big success was we created a multi-generational coalition. It was initially on the tax to improve the tax credit, and then it moved to Title 20. And we brought senior groups and children's groups together to try to improve the tax credit and to expand Title 20. And many children's groups, child care groups, started writing into Congress, and we won a $300 million increase in Title 20. We got half the cuts. So that was a success. Then time moved on. It was 1985, 1986, and the demographics in the world changed in this country. More and more women went to work. We did a report that showed over time the increase in women working. And guess what happened? Congress started clamoring for a child care bill because they realized how little we had there. And George Miller, who was a wonderful member of Congress from California, had a select committee on children, and his first issue that they looked into was child care. And I wrote a memo to Marion and said, we could maybe get a child care bill passed, but we had to have a buy-in from the field, and we had to, we should make it an election issue. I have to confess, we didn't make it an election issue. We created a lot of attention to childcare, but because Congress wanted to pass a bill and it was so popular because of the demographics, it became an election issue. I think it's hard to actually try to make something an election issue. We created a national alliance of 130 organizations, and 30 of them spent a year working on the bill, and CDF drafted the bill. And it was very important that we had all these national groups, National Council of Jewish Women, the NEA, NAEYC, American Federation of Teachers. But what was most important was that we decided we had to have state alliances for better childcare. And Amy Wilkins, who was a young organizer, went out and she had meetings in about 30 states. I went out to 2. I remember being in a church in Worcester, Massachusetts, and the people working in childcare helped us set up these meetings. And we created a list of key contacts. Carol Burnett, I don't know at that time you were a key contact, but they were many familiar names. And those key contacts took the responsibility of organizing to get this bill passed in their states. There was no email. There were no faxes. What the field did was create telephone trees. It was not as easy as it is now. They made very effective telephone trees. And I was on the Hill full time. Amy was in her office with some grapefruit juice and pretzels for 3 years, telling the field what was going on all the time and asking them what to do and asking them to contribute. Again, it was people running childcare centers. It was people running R&Rs. It was somebody who was working for High Scope. We found all these people who were willing to lead these alliances, and people wrote jillions of postcards. They held local events. They got Dan Rostenkowski, who was chair of the Ways and Means Committee, really angry when they picketed outside his office. They wrote op-eds and sent them to local papers. They made visits and they got editorial boards to support the child care bill. They sent little lobbyists to the Hill. This bill was so well known that my friend Nancy Amade would be in the middle of Iowa and she'd say, people were asking me about the child care bill. Another woman who worked with me was camping on a mountain in Vermont. Someone asked her about, it was then called the Act for Better Childcare. It was so well known because of the work of the field. The childcare community, through telephone trees, were able to block the phones of the Speaker of the House and the Senate Majority Leader till they called us and told us to please stop. At one point, we were having trouble moving the bill in the House, and Orrin Hatch, who was our major Republican co-sponsor, said to me, go get those people you have in the field to bother Tom Foley like you had bothered me. And at the end of this campaign, when we were absolutely desperate, this has gone on for 3 years, and we knew our window was shrinking and we had to get this bill passed, people in the childcare field made miles of paper chains. They filled the offices of CDF and NAEYC, and the national groups stretched them from the White House to the Capitol. We got more media, and members of Congress hung them on their doors. You know, there were a lot of things, other things we did, but honestly, it was people in the childcare field who delivered. We had 2 meetings at the 4-H Center where you all slept in bunk beds, and at one point, we brought people on a bus to Marion's up a hill to get them, to make them more willing to move on, because people had worked for a whole year in 1988 and it hadn't happened. And so it was 1989. So we had to make people feel better. When this was over, we brought people together to work on the regulations and to work on implementation, because we understood how important the field was to making the bill happen when it was passed. And then we had a fight with the Bush administration around regulations, and we got the field to send in 800 comments. Again, this was all done by sending alerts, stuffing envelopes, and by telephone. So we really understood the importance of the field, and we had these meetings went on, they continued for 30 years, because it was really important to get people together every year in a safe environment to talk about what worked and what didn't work, not just federal issues, but what, state strategies were important. And again, this was when there weren't so many meetings going on. And, obviously there were a lot more has happened over the years. When I came to the National Women's Law Center, the field also had a major influence on welfare reform. Bill Clinton ran saying he was going to reform welfare as we knew it. We knew that if you weren't going to be able to stop changing an entitlement to welfare, you were going to need a lot of childcare. We worked against his welfare plan, but we also worked about the importance of childcare money. When Congress both houses became Republican with a plan to cut a lot of money, it sounds like the project for 2025, we brought people together at an NAEYC meeting for an emergency meeting. And when we had our annual childcare meeting, we decided the best strategy was to have a motto that said childcare keeps America working. And we also decided that we needed money first. We had to make sure that there was enough money in that welfare bill for childcare. And the field was united. It also works when everybody has the same message. And as all they did for a year was write about money. They didn't write about quality, they wrote about money. And when we got the governors on our side and the Hill agreed to have a major increase in childcare funding, then we talked about quality. That point, there was a small quality set aside in the Child Care and Development Block Grant and standards that fit in a thimble. But the governors didn't want to maintain either one because they wanted total flexibility. And so then the field started talking about quality. Patty Siegel and I went to a legislator who had been in the California Senate and had created a program called Trust Line, which did background checks on informal providers, and told him that that couldn't happen if we didn't have these minimal standards and the quality set aside, and he helped us. But again, there was a lot of discipline. Everyone spoke about one issue first, and then they spoke about another issue. People were not confusing at all. Then, we got a major increase in childcare funding under the Trump administration. And again, a lot of it was people had the same message. But we always knew that whatever was going to happen, we had to know what was going on in local communities, how things were, how whatever we said or did, whatever policies were enacted, impacted programs directors who were running childcare centers, impacted family childcare providers, impacted family friend and neighbor providers, how Head Start fit in. When I first came to CDF, I was Head Start's lobbyist, how the childcare food program fit in. You really had to have a complete picture. And you always got that picture from people on the ground. And just like Niall said, it worked if you showed respect, because people on the ground know a lot more than what we do. And that takes relationships. It takes being willing to hang on the phone, be willing to say, here I am, you need some help, you want to know what this other state did, you have to be available. It's a lot of the key issues of how you would get along with anybody, any of your friends or anyone you want to influence. You have to be true partners to the field. And I couldn't have accomplished anything we did, and I know we still have a long way to go. It's just America. Everything takes a long time to do things right. But it doesn't work unless all of you out there play a major role with your legislatures, your own state legislators, your city councils, your members of Congress, the administration. When President Obama was going to propose a federal pre-K bill, people in childcare made hundreds of pictures, children in childcare. And what we did with those pictures is we hung them on we didn't do the people at Department of Health and Human Services and Education hung them in their hallways. And before that, we had delivered them to the White House to show the president, to show his agencies, to show Congress that people in the field were behind him. People need support. And of course, people in the field matter more to members of Congress than we do sitting in national organizations, because that's who votes for them. And that's a very important lesson. So we just want you to keep on. And obviously taking part in this year's election is a big piece of that, making sure that everybody you work with is registered to vote, because that is, you know, how we make a difference. And that's about the story. There's lots of other ones, but it was a 40-year partnership with everybody out there. And again, now we have lots of organizations who are doing that job. But you know, we understood at the beginning that we had to create a floor. Laura, you are. Yeah.
I am so excited just hearing you tell this story. And I know that you've written a long document that tells more of the detail. For those of you who aren't familiar with CAYL webinar series, we do provide you after this webinar a list of resources where you can dig deeper. I want to ask our co-panelists, Niall and also Michelle, to join me as we think together in the few minutes that we have about what we've really been learning here. Really exciting. I want to say that I kind of summarize what we've been learning is, you know, relationships matter. This is not a new message to us in early childhood. We know relationships matter, but it also matters in getting out the vote. I'm also listening so carefully to how the work that we've gotten done over the decades have been bipartisan efforts, that we've seen Republican and Democrats stepping up to the plate. I also see the very strong role of practitioners in getting this done and telling our stories, that this network of distributed leadership is so important. And how we keep our work visible really matters, whether it's the doll chains or the paper chains, keeping our work and our message visible. But most of all, Helen, especially back in those early days, and you know, I was there with you, how we had one message at that time. And you call it a discipline. It's a discipline that we yearn for sometimes right now, how much that mattered. I want to call on you, Michelle, to see if you had any thoughts before we start having questions with Niall and with Helen.
Yeah, no. Well, I first want to thank Niall and Helen for sharing the incredible work of each of their organizations over their histories, and elevating to me. One of the things that's so clear is that the relationships matter, and centering the stories and the expertise of the people who are doing this work is so critically important in elevating that to the tables of influence and where policymakers are considering policies that impact children. Early childhood educators do this work day in and day out in all these settings across the country, whether they're family childcare homes or schools or centers, Head Start programs, and trusting that expertise, but then also standing in that expertise. And so if you're an educator and you think, oh, well, they're not going to hear me or they're not going to listen to me, centering your expertise and your voice at the table is so important. So, you know, stand in and believe the importance of the work that you do, that your story matters, and, you know, elevate that story, you know, in town halls and writing policymakers and sharing what you know to be true of what's important for providing developmentally appropriate environments and high quality early learning. So that's something that strikes me, Helen, as you were talking about, like bringing forward the voices of the educator, and Niall, and talking about organizing and bringing forward again the power of relationships and bringing forward the expertise of the people in this field as we navigate forward, making sure that early childhood education is part of every agenda.
So Laura, before we go, I forgot the dolls. And just one quick story is that when we were working on the welfare bill, when we had our annual meeting at Haley Farm, Colorado advocates shared how they brought life-size dolls to the floor of their state legislature. And Child Care Aware, which was then NACRA, agreed when their conference came, people would bring these big life-size cardboard dolls. And at that point, Congress was like destroying everything very quickly all night. And there was supposed to be a press conference the first day of the NACRA meeting with the dolls. But we called their office that night because they were marking up or writing a bill that was cutting the child care block grant, the food program, and people brought the dolls to the markup to the back of the room on the Hill and held up the big dolls. And the next day they were at the press conference, and then they were banned from the Capitol. They couldn't come in through the safety machines. And over Valentine's Day, people had sent in small dolls, and so those dolls were infamous. And again, it was the field who made the dolls, not us.
Absolutely. We can never forget those dolls. That was a big moment for us. And the dolls also, Helen, had a story. So when you looked at the doll, you could hear the story of, a child or a family that was struggling and who could benefit by more support. Niall, tell us a little bit more about this relationship. We're a field of early childhood educators. There's 2 million of us. We matter. Sometimes we think we're just a small number compared to other kinds of groups. But I love the way you talked about this networking and how we influence the people within our circle and how much it matters. I'm thinking back about Michelle saying that NAEYC is asking people to make a voting plan, and for employers, if possible, to allow for our people to be able to go to the polls and perhaps do work around election-related work. Talk a little bit about these networks and how powerful that voice is, person to person.
There you go.
Yeah, a joke that I always make is that you have shows like West Wing and
Yes,
Veep,
right
and
there.
there's this idea that if someone monologues at you for 2 minutes, you'll suddenly think about how much this democracy matters, and then you'll be like, I guess I'm gonna do it. But that's not really how it happens. I think for me, I actually spent the first 5 years of my life in Iowa. We were based in the DMV, but my mom went back there to get her master's. And I remember my mom helping to organize caucuses when my grandmother went from Iowa back down to Mississippi, where she was originally from. When I would go every summer, we were doing voter registration. One of our summer trips was to kind of do the civil rights history circuit around Selma, Alabama, right? And so all of those little intricacies went into me feeling empowered in politics. So when I was entering these rooms, I didn't necessarily have the cool off period of feeling whether or not I could speak, whether or not I had a role. It was implicit to how I was raised and how I was like socially conditioned to feel like I have a role and that I not only have a voice, but a voice worth listening to. And I feel like those immediate touch points that are really consistent and intimate is something where we see early childcare working through. I think it's the same as when we're looking at outcomes around math and reading. So like getting those early on books before you even hit pre-K is the difference between meeting your metrics and not in terms of a student to student analysis. So I think that those relationships are really important. And I saw that in some of the data that I shared, we saw how a significant population of Gen Z voters have parents who are immigrants, right? And so while some of them are going to be naturalized and thus voting in their youth, some of them aren't. Some of them are still translating for their parents, right? So oftentimes early childcare relationships and like teachers, all these different infrastructures are going to be the people who have the information, who have the context to introduce some of these ideas to young people that they might not actually get in their homes. And I think especially when it comes to the League of Women Voters, it's not necessarily just a question of who you're voting for or partisan outreach, but just knowing beyond the 3 branches what it means to have a democracy and what it means to have a role in it. So I think that those relationships are really important. And I said this in a message to someone, but as we're doing this call, I'm on campus with one of our Young Voter Power Initiative cohort members tabling. And so much of this is us having conversations, engaging people, not just giving them our 5 lines of why to vote, but talking about where they're from, whether or not they have a comptroller, what it means voting for them, making jokes, engaging. Because I also think an important part of the work is sometimes the foot in the door is someone liking you, someone laughing at your joke, someone appreciating you from their church community or from their school community or other childcare experiences as well, right? So it's super important to invest in these relationships because I think that's where a lot of the work happens and not necessarily during presidential debates. So I guess that's my answer.
Oh, really?
Thanks, Niall. Our time is so limited. I want to remind everybody that you'll see in the chat, there's a link so that if you want to interact with Michelle and Nal and Helen, click that link right at 5 o'clock when this ends. You'll be able to have a conversation with them. Because our time is limited, Helen, I want to ask you a question that really has to do with courage. Because I think that, it takes a lot of courage to make change. But also change doesn't happen unless we vote for it, unless we work for it. And when we think about many of the people who've been on our series this year, courageous people in this field and the contributions that they've made, it's really easy for us to get to the bottom line and say, wow, that Helen Blank is amazing, or other speakers that we've had are so amazing. Their contributions have been so deep and long lasting. But can you talk to us a little bit about courage and the courage it takes to, right where we are, be a leader that steps up for children and families and the people that do the work, the practitioners Michelle's talking about?
Well, remember, I worked with Marian Wright Edelman, who was the first African-American, I think not only person or woman, to be appointed to the Mississippi bar, and who was kicked down the courthouse steps. And the office, you never knew who was going to be walking through the city office. Was it Miss King? Was it Miss Dorothy Height? Was it Andrew Young? And that was courage. And to step out, someone took me to lunch and said, what are you talking about? You're asking for 2.5 billion for childcare. You'll never get it. Trying to do something different always takes courage. Going to ask for something always takes courage, right? We're always asking. Working with young children every day takes a lot of courage. You can sit around and talk about things, but going to do anything takes courage. And a lot of people are going to tell you why you can't do something, or how hard it's going to be, or these are bad times. And you have to get yourself together and walk out the door and figure out what to do next. And with us and trying to get that, it was then called the Act for Better Childcare, which is a lot prettier than CCDBG. It was what we can do every day different to try to make it happen. Because what you do one day is never enough. So it's also courage to understand that this is a long haul, and you have to be willing to be flexible, change your tactics, come up with new tactics, have a lot of people say mean things to you. It all takes some courage.
Yeah, Michelle, you'll have the last word. Children can't vote. We all know that. Many of our practitioners may be challenged to vote because of their work hours and other ways. NAEYC for many, many years have had a campaign about America voting for kids. And the last word, what would you offer for us as we show up for courage to vote our values?
Well, first, I'd say no one knows better what the impact is of being able to know that our policymakers are aware of what it takes to work with young children than the people who are doing it every day. Mm-hmm. And pointing back to our resources that we have on America for Early Ed, I think that we all want to make sure that the respective voices of the adults who are working on behalf of young children show up in the voting process. And so working with your program directors and owners to ensure that there is support for this, ensuring that you have the capacity to be able to vote. It is difficult, but I also think that all of us embrace and understand how important it is to make sure that we are carrying forward for young children the votes for them, through our work. So I want to thank everyone for being part of this conversation. Valora, you and I both know how important this topic is. For everyone to be able to make sure that their voices are known in this voting process. And I know that the conversation will continue in the next webinar.
Absolutely. Next month, please join us. We have our 3 big national organizations talking about how are we going to move post-election into an advocacy agenda for children. So the work continues, as Helen Blank just taught us. It goes way back, but it's continuing today. What do our three major organizations, 0 to 3, National Association of Family Child Care, and National Association for the Education of Young Children, have to say to us about how we're going to advance our advocacy agenda? Because no matter who wins the election, we still have to stand for children. So join us next month as we have this conversation. And join us now. And if you press the link, you can be in the conversation with Michelle, Helen, and Niall. And thank you to the NAEYC team and the CAYL team for putting this webinar together. And thank each and every one of you for learning with us today. Good night.